Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Definitely Not Another Podcast. My name is Neal Moore, and despite the name of the show, you can in fact subscribe to it on iTunes, Spotify and YouTube, for which I had been preparing you a lovely bushy lockdown beard for today, but when my wife took a look at it yesterday, she said it looked more like a patchy bit of scrubland beneath my lips. Today's podcast is grounded with Louis Theroux, a brand new show from the BBC. Now, Louis Theroux is quite a famous documentary filmmaker, and he generally is the star of his documentaries as he immerses himself in unusual subcultures such as neo-Nazis, Scientologists, even sex offenders. Now, Louis is something of a Marmite character. You either love him or you hate him. The way that he ingratiates himself into these communities is essentially by adopting a sort of wide-eyed work experience boy persona. To some people this is clearly transparent and fake. To others it's quite a clever ruse to disarm his subjects and get them to open up to him and reveal more. Louis, like the rest of us, is on lockdown right now, so he's decided to open his very impressive black book of famous contacts and give them a buzz over Zoom and have a chat about life. Now, the reason I chose to review this particular podcast is it's reminiscent of the type of podcast that so many brands and corporations try to make, and even individuals, where they essentially sit down with a mate or a colleague and have a meandering chat for an hour or so about, well, in the corporate world, sort of vague opportunities and threats to their business, and in the personal sphere, just life. And what I find is that they lack purpose, they lack direction, they lack format and structure. There's no reason to listen to the end, there's no point, there's no takeaway. And it's very lazy content creation, I find. And what happens is the episodes tend to run very, very long, even though they quickly run out of steam. And the series tend to run short as they very quickly run out of people to invite for this meandering chat. What I want to know is, does a journalist and filmmaker of Louis' caliber, paired with guests who are famous and accomplished, does that overcome the problems of this format? Let's have a listen and find out.
Hello, I'm Louis Theroux, and welcome to my new podcast series for Radio 4, Grounded, with Louis Theroux. I'll try and keep this one a bit shorter. Like you, I'm in lockdown. But as it turns out, so too are many people I've always been keen to talk to, which leaves me with a laptop, a dodgy microphone, and the vagaries of the interweb to try and make a connection. This looks promising. Hello! There's John.
Yeah, it's working.
I'm relying on my guests to record their half of our conversations.
Is the meter flickering? Yes, and it seems to be perfect. It's stopping just before the red.
And we get to see each other via state-of-the-art video conferencing software, downloaded from the nether regions of the web.
When somebody talks, does the machine somehow know? Like when you talked just then, Louis, you came up full screen. Is that how Zoom works?
That's one of the options. Zoom must be making so much money right now, don't you think?
I don't quite understand why everybody's suddenly jumped ship from Skype and FaceTime.
First up, this is Louis' shtick, acting as though the internet, which has been around for 25 years, is something bizarre and futuristic that he calls the interwebs, and behaving as though video conference calls are something he just read about in a sci-fi novel, when in reality he's probably sat on as many boring work video con calls as the rest of us. He's a professional Forrest Gump. He stumbles into the room, ends up in these places going, oh my good golly gosh, what's going on around here? Now, you've got to either buy into that or not, but trust me, if you don't like it, it's not going to get any easier to listen to. Louis' first guest struck me as a very strange choice. Jon Ronson is like his professional doppelganger. He's a journalist and documentary filmmaker who specializes in people on the sort of outskirts of society. He's had a very similar career to Louis, and he adopts a very similar style, this kind of slightly fey, nerdy work experience boy thing, which does, effectively disarm guests, but can be quite annoying. I happen to be quite a fan of Jon Ronson. He's made some wonderful podcast series, which I may review later, and written some great books. The problem, though, is that as much as it could be an interesting conversation between two journalists about their careers and their rivalry, it could also be like listening to two colleagues in the same firm engaging in shop talk. As it happens, it's a bit of both. Like so many of these conversational podcasts, it takes an age to get started. There's lots of catching up and how are you and what's life like in lockdown, which is a really pointless question. It's pretty much the same for everybody. It's boring, it's frustrating, it's helpless, homeschooling's a pain in the butt. Don't ask that question, it's irrelevant. It takes a good 20 minutes, about a third of the length of the podcast, to get into it and for Louis to ask the first proper journalistic question, which is about how, in John's eyes, as a Brit now living in America, the two societies, Britain and America, are responding differently to the pandemic. The meat of the podcast is really served about halfway through, when Louis finally starts asking John about his area of expertise, which in this case is about conspiracy theories. John wrote a book about it, spent a long time studying it, and he gives us a real insight into why conspiracy theories exist, who starts them, why do they start them, where do they come from, and how do they spread, which is really interesting at the moment as it applies to coronavirus and the conspiracy theories sort of flying around about that. It gives us a lens through which to view the current explosion in fake news, which I found fascinating. John also talks about his podcast series, The Last Days of August, which is about the mysterious death of porn star August Ames. If you are a fan of narrative true crime, if you loved Serial, you will love that series. I listened to it start to finish in I think 2 sessions because it is just so compelling. Interestingly, towards the end of the podcast, Louis and John return to discussing their sort of professional rivalry, but in terms of their ethics, their responsibility to the people they feature in their books and documentaries, and how they respond to backlashes and criticism they get from those people. In fact, John went so far as to write a book called So You've Been Publicly Shamed, which is about people whose entire lives are cancelled due to one, poorly worded tweet or some sort of Facebook faux pas. How do you live with that worry? Well, the insight for me that came from John was it's all about intent. What was your intention in putting that piece out? Were you intending to do good, be informative, change perceptions, or were you intending to catch someone out and indulge in gotcha journalism? If you can defend the intention of what you set out to do, then you don't have to fear criticism. And I think that is incredibly reassuring. I think Louis' choice of guest for the second episode was far more interesting. Boy George was an 80s pop sensation who became a 90s DJ, very successfully so, and is now a coach on The Voice. He was famous not only for making records, but really challenging gender stereotypes back when it was probably a lot more dangerous than doing that now. He is a man who's been completely through the celebrity spin cycle, but backs it up with genuine talent and good humour. And he comes from a world that Louis is not familiar with. And I think that's when Louis is best, when he's confronted with a world that he doesn't know and has to really employ his journalistic talent and instincts to get in there. Gone was the small talk and the backslapping, with Louis getting straight into the meat of the conversation, drawing from George's own autobiography. Unfortunately though, in the first couple of minutes of the interview, Louis starts asking George about a relationship he had at 15 with a much, much older man, asking if George had lost his virginity to that man. George, like the media pro he is, managed to sort of laugh it off and tell Louis that he needed to engage in some foreplay before asking a question like that. But I think George did a great job. There is far too much prurient fascination with the sex lives of gay men. Louis didn't ask John Ronson about his virginity or who he'd slept with. I'll be prepared to bet that he's not going to ask that of his next guest, which I believe is Helena Bonham Carter. But he couldn't help himself with George, and frankly, there's a lot more interesting things to ask Boy George. Recently, George has received some criticism for his views on trans rights, which may seem odd for somebody who was instrumental in challenging gender boundaries 35 odd years ago. But as it turns out, his issue is not really with trans people or anything like that. It's the need to constantly label people, put them in boxes, and then tell them, based on those boxes, what they should think and how they should vote. He is an artist who throughout his career has not only played with gender, but genres as well, mixing punk and reggae, soul and acid house. He's an artist who picks from all over the place and gathers it together. What he resents is the rigid politics of the identitarians. Ultimately, his philosophy is live and let live, and I think ultimately that's probably mine too. My favourite part of the conversation came towards the end as Louis started to ask Boy George about his later career, and I found his answers really surprising and inspiring. Despite Louis' fairly ill-informed attempts to restrict George's legacy and success to his band Culture Club in the 1980s, George doesn't see it that way at all. In fact, he believes himself to be more productive than he's ever been. to be a master of his craft now at this end of his career, that he has higher standards than ever before, more control over his output, and makes more money. After his band Culture Club ended in the late 80s, George didn't feel like his career was over. He felt like the first phase had come to a natural end, and so the next phase could begin, and he went on to become one of the top, most famous, well-traveled and well-paid DJs in the world. Like his hero David Bowie, he's a shapeshifter, a chameleon. He has moved with the times. He has stayed invested and engaged and relevant. And he seems happier and more confident now than he's ever been, despite being single, as Louis keeps returning back to his sex life and what he's up to with his partners. Like most of these conversational podcasts, it does lack some format, some structure, some purpose. We're going through together this momentous moment in history which has the potential to create incredible systemic change. And if I had access to these sorts of thinkers and doers and performers and creatives, I think maybe I'd want to ask them for their view on what world we might emerge into, or could we emerge into? How could we envision a fairer, more equal, more creative world? The series, I believe, was created as a distraction from sitting sort of square-eyed and slack-jawed in front of the television, which is fine, and I am glad they did it, and I will continue listening to it. But I still think it could use a little bit more structure to it. A really good example is Josh Gad, who played Olaf in Frozen, has started a new YouTube show called Reunited Apart, where he gathers the casts and crews of classic films. He did The Goonies first, and he's doing Back to the Future next. And it seems like an easygoing, sort of free-flowing conversation, but if you look closely, you can see how beautifully engineered that show is. Thank you so much for listening and watching. I hope you found it interesting and useful. If you would like to take issue with me in a polite and constructive way, or you want to recommend something for me to listen to, you are very welcome to email me. For those that are not watching this on YouTube and can't see my email address on the screen behind me, it's neal@mooreslaw.com. That's neal@mooreslore.com. Thank you once again, and I'll be back with episode 4 very shortly.